the Russians should not expect to remain immune from the consequences of their actions. They have to be supported. We are supporting them. One might say we could have taken the shackles off a little bit earlier than this. This will be really, as I said, discombobulating the Russian planners at the moment, because they clearly hadn't expected this.
British Challenger 2 tanks are being used by Ukrainian forces for their offensive inside Russia. The government has confirmed this now. It's the first time that British military hardware has been used on Russian territory. And it comes as Ukrainian forces are believed to have seized up to 300 square miles of Russian land. Let's talk to Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff. Good afternoon, Sir Simon.
Hi, Cal. Good afternoon.
Um, how surprised are you about the use of British military hardware on Russian territory?
Not at all. They're among the very best tanks in the world, ideally suited for the land, the territory on the Ukrainian-Russian border. And as long as they're being used alongside infantry, armored infantry, reconnaissance, supported by artillery, drones, etc., they're a remarkably potent vehicle and tank, one of the best in the world. There are
No
only
one's
small numbers
doubting
of them.
how good this equipment is, but the point is that the British government has always been insistent that the military kit that it's providing to Ukrainian forces is to be used in a defensive operation. It now seems to be used offensively in order to take Russian territory.
Yeah, the great military cry, Carol, of course, is the best form of defense is attack. And that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing, really discombobulating the Russian defenses and the Russian planning. They won't be alone. They've got plenty of armor from the Germans and the Americans, and this is exactly what needs to be done. I think the British government has confirmed that it's given permission for those tanks to be used outside Ukrainian territory, and that's the reality. You want to attack a country. Don't expect to be able to sit back and then conduct it at your leisure.
We are hearing, though, that these British Storm Shadow missile systems are not being allowed or not being used by Ukrainian forces inside Russia. I mean, why the disparity? Why is it okay to use tanks but not missiles?
Well, a missile is a very, very long range, great depth. We're talking about going deep inside Russia. Let's be very clear: the offensive we're talking about, although you sort of talk about 300 square miles, this is a sort of land the Germans and the Russians fought over in the Second World War. Vast amounts of the Russian steppe, with not, frankly, much in it, and not really of strategic interest, of tactical interest. But we shall see whether there's anything at the operational level. Storm Shadow can be used to strike strategic targets well inside Russia. Tanks and infantry are only going to be seizing ground, small hamlets, villages at the moment. But we'll see whether it's linked to a much bigger operational plan by the Ukrainians.
Are there not risks, though, here that Britain and its forces, its military capabilities are being drawn ever more into this conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, there's always risk in war, Carol, but I'm afraid the Russians also have to accept that they took a risk when they invaded Ukraine nearly 3 years ago in what they termed a special military operation, all due to be over in 7 days. They've now been slugging it away for well over 2 years now. And the Ukrainians have every right to defend their territory. The Russians should not expect to remain immune from the consequences of their actions. They have to be supported. We are supporting them. One might say we could have taken the shackles off a little bit earlier than this. This will be really, as I said, discombobulating the Russian planners at the moment, because they clearly hadn't expected this. We shouldn't be overemphasizing the scale of it yet. As I say, 14 tanks, and even if it's a number of other French, German, etc. vehicles, does not constitute a major offensive. But we shall see what effect it has on what is already a pretty battered Russian military.
But there have been incremental changes, haven't there, ever since this war began? Initially, we were providing armored vehicles, but not tanks, and then that changed, and we sent tanks, and then we were only going to provide a certain amount of or a certain type of missiles, and then we did provide the longer range missiles. Should there not have been at least an announcement of the policy here if we're going to have British tanks operating on Russian territory, and indeed perhaps a debate and a vote in the House of Commons?
Well, I'm a great supporter of the royal prerogative, frankly. I don't like the erosion. It's the responsibility of a government to make decision. If you start outsourcing your decision making to the public or the media or even domestic politics, I think that's very bad for a country like ours. So I support, clearly the government, the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary have the advice of the civil service, they have the advice of the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Defence Staff, etc. They've clearly made it clear to Zelensky, as have other nations, that we've reached a stage in this conflict that this can go forward. But I am not a fan, I'm afraid, of subcontracting decisions that should be taken by the executive to some sort of student debate. These are really serious issues.
I wasn't talking about a student debate. I was talking about a debate from our elected representatives in the House of Commons.
No, even that, I'm afraid, Carol. The ball was dropped by Cameron over striking the Syrians, and we saw what happened. The government have the access to all the intelligence. They know what the diplomatic, political scenarios are. They know what the ranges, the capabilities that are involved. They know the consequences. They war gamed it properly. And they should take on the responsibility as the government, the executive, of making those decisions. And they clearly have.
How do you think Russia's going to respond to this?
I think it's going to panic. It'll have to thrash out a bit. It's a bit like we're waiting for the Iranians to do something over the Israeli strike against Hania. But I suspect this is really going to rattle the Russian planners, and it's going to make the Russian army very nervous that it's quite extended lines of communication, logistics supply for their operations within Ukraine are now being threatened. I don't know the scale of the Ukrainian offensive at the moment, but it's exactly what I'm afraid an army that is on the defensive and lacking the sheer numbers that the Russians have against them needs to be doing in order to retake the initiative.
But Russia does have considerable armed forces, considerable amounts of military hardware, missiles, nuclear weapons. I mean, you talk about the fact that it could panic. Could that not then lead to some very serious reprisals on Ukrainian troops and perhaps against Britain for its role in this?
Carol, all these things could go. But this is the problem when you're up against someone like Putin. And Russia at the moment with its mythologizing of its right to invade a neighboring country. They're the ones that, you're inclined to say, what are you suggesting? That Ukraine just rolls over because we are slightly worried about the consequences. We have been in a war fundamentally with Russia since 2008. And you could argue very much so since 2014 and certainly since 2022. And we've done very, very little. And we've slightly, again, subcontracted the defense of Western Europe and NATO to the Ukrainians. Okay. And they're doing their damnedest to fight at huge cost to themselves. And we've got to steel ourselves. We need a certain amount of honesty with the public that Russia constitutes a major threat to international stability, regional stability, and European security.
British Challenger 2 tanks are believed to have been used in Ukraine's offensive inside Russia, sources have disclosed to The Times. The paper previously reported how the UK government had allowed Ukraine to use British weapons in its cross-border incursion. And on Thursday, sources told Larissa Brown, the defence editor we're going to speak to in just a second, that an unspecified number of tanks had been deployed in the Kursk region, marking the first time British tanks operated by Ukrainian troops had been used in combat on Russian territory. Well, Larissa's with me now. Larissa, how big a deal is this, and how much will the Ministry of Defence be worried, interested, concerned about this, or was this just totally expected?
It seems important because I've sort of spent the last few days trying to sort of iron out exactly what the British policy has been on all of this, and it was only yesterday that I managed to get confirmation from the government that they were allowing Ukraine to use British weapons inside Russia. And so then obviously today it's emerged that they have actually already used them. They've got Challenger tanks on the battlefield. So I think it's quite surprising, but also I suppose you could also look at it that, is it also, is it expected in the sense that Ukraine has obviously got all of this equipment from the West, and now it obviously wants to use it in its huge offensive inside Kursk?
Yeah, it's interesting, Larissa, as well, because in terms of the rules that apply and I suppose, the conditions that are attached to these, donations of weapons and money and so on, this wasn't out of the realms of possibility. But of course, the incursion into Russia was and has been a huge shock. And the MOD, what's kind of been their reaction to it, both officially and unofficially?
Yes, I think that basically people weren't prepared for Ukraine to actually go into Russian territory in the way that they have. And of course, when the policy was implemented by Ben Wallace, the previous Defence Secretary, he was saying that the Ukrainians can use British weapons with the exception of a Storm Shadow long-range missile inside Russia, but they were obviously being used to hit targets from Ukrainian territory. Now, of course, things have escalated quite significantly, and obviously you've got 10,000 Ukrainian troops inside Russia using the weapons, and so you've now got these images circulating on social media showing the Challenger, one Challenger 2 tank apparently being destroyed by the Russians, and it's obviously playing out in Russia. And obviously this drags Britain sort of further into this war, really, because you've got these British weapons so openly being used.
And as a NATO country, that is something, of course, one of the main issues is that Ukraine isn't a NATO country, but has been supported in many ways by NATO countries. We know that special forces were on the ground in Ukraine as well. Is there a worry that Putin will react and blame the United Kingdom, or is Ukraine 100% in his mind's eye in regard to this?
We'll hear something from the Russians about, Western donated kit being used as part of this offensive. But I think the real sort of worry has actually been around Storm Shadow, the long-range missiles, which Britain has said Ukraine cannot use. And I think if that changed, I think if Britain and others did allow Ukraine to use longer-range missiles, and I think we would expect a much stronger response from Vladimir Putin. Experts have been telling me how, that would be a much bigger deal than sort of using these short-range tactical weapons, because he would fear that the Ukrainians could use long-range missiles to, take out Russian cities and even try and, get Putin himself.